Hello, my name is Margaret Adele, and welcome to a rambling discussion on why I hate and love and hate readathons. Now, this is going to be a rambling discussion. I don't really have an outline. I might miss points that you thought should be included. Please feel free to comment those down below. Now, I will be going into a quick overview of what readathons are because I know that some of my viewers are indie authors that aren't really into the booktuber/bookternet community on that side. So, readathons are a challenge usually set by a booktuber or other person on the bookternet. Are they really a thing on Book Talk? I haven't seen a lot of them. In which you are challenged as the reader to participate. You must read X amount of books in X amount of time. The original readathon called Booktubeathon, then known as Reading Rush, went for a week, and I believe it usually had 5 prompts, either 5 reading prompts and an extra non-reading prompt, or 4 and an extra non-reading prompt. I cannot remember. I never participated in that one. And by the time I had joined BookTube in 2018, readathons were already pretty universal, and they had gone way far beyond the week with 5 prompts idea. There's now so many more complexities to it. There are teams and bingo boards and teams with bingo boards and points and trackers, and it's gotten way bigger than it was before. The original Reading Rush, back when it was still going, I believe the last one was 2020. As of right now, I have not heard any sign of it coming back anytime soon. Had like badges and a website and like merch and stuff. And there will be merch usually attached to a readathon that already has someone that runs like an Etsy store. They won't necessarily be like, oh, we have this readathon, now let's start creating merch. It's usually somebody already has a candle shop, a bookmark shop. They already are doing something in that vein, and they're just like, hey, you're already a host for this, let's also add in merch. And I actually don't hate that part of it as much. Note, and I will say this, if you have started making money off the concept or the brand of your readathon, you are therefore required to be held to a higher standard because you're now asking for people's money. And that was a whole thing with the Reading Rush back in 2020 where they were selling merch, but also made a ton of little missteps or medium-sized missteps that all added up to make people very upset with the runners of that readathon, which I think is part of the reason they don't run anymore. I don't know. It could still run this year, but I haven't heard anything about it. So there's kind of this higher standard to hold readathons to when you start charging people money for brand-related items, because now you are officially selling the idea of the readathon to people. And yes, I know that the merch stuff is usually not the main part of it, but once your brand is connected to making money, you are to be held to a higher standard, which I don't think that's a very popular opinion to have, but it's one I wholeheartedly believe in. Now, as readathons have continued, they've just exploded, and it's my first biggest hatred point of readathons is in the era of FOMO, aka pre-2020, back when FOMO was still a thing, the sheer amount of readathons was exhausting because it felt like no matter how many readathons you participated in, there was always 5 more that you were missing, and then you felt bad for missing them. And now a lot of people might reply to that with like, well, you don't have to, it's just for fun. But the thing is that the fear of missing out, the gamifying of reading, is a big thing. It's not quite as big anymore. A lot of people, a lot of cultural analysts have kind of said that 2020 low-key killed it, and that when people were shut inside, they were dreaming about specifically going to the events and things or participating in things they wanted to, as opposed to feeling required. I don't know if we'll see a resurgence of it now that more events and things are happening again, but for the most part, I definitely think that people as a whole were getting seriously burned out on readathons because what they looked like changed so much. Beforehand, a lot of the readathons were only a week long and required like 4 to 5 books. So in some cases, you literally had to read a book a day just to keep up. Especially if those books were longer, you'd have to read your small books in a day so that you could read that 400-page book over a couple days or something to that effect. And you can kind of see over time the preferred state of readathons changed a little bit, going from a week long with 5 books to a month long with usually somewhere around 8 to 12 books. And while, yes, there's more books in that requirement, they also quadrupled the length of time. So by doing the math, where it used to be you would have to read 1 book every 1.5 days, it now became you have to read 1 book over every 2 to 3 days or 3 to 4 days, depending on the extent of the readathon. So you can kind of see everyone realizing that the week-long 5 prompt series just wasn't sustainable for anyone. Now, if you're a bookish person participating in bookish social media, you're probably already reading more than the average person just by nature of wanting to get invested in this area of social media. But even that was extreme for the most avid of Bookternet people. Unless you were one of those reading 300 manga a year people, that was not something you could keep up, and you can kind of see that. However, the other way that they have kind of increased the chance that you'll feel bad if you don't participate is in teams and winning. Most readathons that are run the month have specific teams that you join, and they have bingo boards and points and trackers and all of that. It's a whole lot more, and there is a winning team. Now, a lot of these readathons will also say something to the effect of, do as many of the prompts as you want, and all that kind of stuff. And yes, you can technically participate in all of those readathons by only reading like a couple books to fit the prompts. But the thing is that when there is a winning team with points and numbers, and you want your numbers to be high, people will feel more pressure to keep doing that. Even with Whatever-a-thon, which is a readathon specifically made to make it easier with you being able to set your own limit for books, there's still a bingo board, and you can only have 1 book can only account for 3 prompts on the bingo board. So there's still a minimum number of books you have to read to complete that bingo board to get those points. And there's still that urge to read more beyond what you would normally. Now, I know a lot of people are going to fight with it. Well, that's just on you. And yes, but that also means that if more people start feeling pressure to read books they don't want in readathons, they're probably going to give up on the idea of readathons altogether. And some of my least favorite prompts are read outside your comfort zone. Here's the thing. That prompt is very purposeful and useful when you only read a very limited number of genres. Like if you're that only high fantasy person, or only contemporary YA, or only thrillers, like, yeah, that could be helpful to you. The thing is, for a lot of people who read over a wider range of genres, the genres they don't read are the ones they don't read because they don't like. So basically, this prompt becomes, read a genre you don't like during this readathon where you're already reading a ton of books. So it's like, yeah, is there a chance that that high school YA book about the people that want to become popular could be something I end up liking? A very slim chance, yes, but it's much more likely that I'll just be annoyed at having to read that. And also there's the other one I struggle with, which is read a host faves. So you'll have hosts for each of the teams, or the main host for the readathon. I see so few readathons that don't have teams anymore though, wherein you have to pick from a very specific select list of books. I think the most I've ever seen them being is like 15 books, and you have to pick one of those to read. And which means I have to get new books for the readathon, which one of the biggest benefits for me for a readathon was that you could get through your TBR list a lot faster. That you could really get through those books that you keep saying you were going to read, but now you'd have extra incentive. But if I have to get a new book that I don't already own, that kind of ruins that premise. Alternatively, I also have some struggles with the read a different format, because the only different format thing that counts for me is audiobooks. And I don't read audiobooks very often because I struggle with them. So a lot of these prompts are like, not only should you be reading a lot of books in a short period of time, but you should also be reading books that are a struggle for you. It's like, and this wouldn't be so bad if readathons were more spaced out, but there are so many. We have beyond reached the point of market saturation when it comes to readathons, to the extent that even with so many readathons no longer running, you can still feel there are so many just based on the number of times that you'll see someone trying to put together their TBR list for the month, and they're trying to fit books into multiple readathons at once, because on any given month, there are multiple readathons going on constantly of different varying lengths, and trying to participate in all of them sounds horrible, to be honest. And there is something to be said for taking breaks for mental health, one, but also letting hype build up for a readathon. Back in the day, as it was explained to me when I was a newbie, the Reading Rush / BookTubeathon was a gigantic deal, and people would wait and would get so excited, and their view counts would soar during that week. And now, participating in a readathon means next to nothing in the way of hype. A readathon is so standard in the community that it's, one, they've had to switch it to, that's not even a challenge anymore, because you can't constantly be challenging people to read above and beyond what they would normally read constantly. That just becomes their new normal. But also, there's always the next thing to get hyped for literally right after. I participated in Whatever-a-thon in June, did not complete it, and felt bad because I could not get Host Fave's prompt read at all. And then I jumped right into the indie book readathon, the Indie Accords. I would not have jumped into that readathon at all if it had not been indie books. The literal only reason is because it was indie books. Would not have touched it beyond that. And it is exhausting, especially when it's like, okay, here's this host faves, and now there's another host fave prompt. And I think part of the reason that I got so disappointed in readathons is people, when I first began, because I started in October of 2018 and almost immediately jumped into my first readathon, that being the Witchathon by Reviv, who it's no longer running. It was sold to me as a great way to build community, that you participate in these readathons and you will just naturally make bookish friends. And not really. And that's not to say you can't, but the number one way to make bookish friends on the bookternet is to read the books everyone else is reading, and that doesn't change with readathons. Readathons will just give you an in with what books everyone else is reading, like with the group books, so there will be at least one book that other people are reading with you, or host faves, you'll have read a book that at least one other person has read. But for the most part, it doesn't really facilitate community like they were supposed to, unless you find the readathon filled with people who are already reading the same kind of books as you. But even then, it's not necessarily the readathon that was the reason that you found that community. It's because you're reading the right kind of books. For example, with this indie book readathon, I am already feeling a lot more connected to other people as opposed to Whatever-a-thon, because in Whatever-a-thon, it was such a fight to find books that I'd read that someone else had read at all. And even then it was just, oh, I have that book also on my TBR. Like, I still felt like the indie weirdo kid in that readathon, despite the fact that I was participating in that readathon. No one wants to do the buddy reads for the indie books. They all want to do buddy reads for books they already own. And if they don't do indie books, that's not going to be a thing. So now that I'm finally in the indie book world, where I know that this is a readathon where people are reading books that I have read. In fact, when I first discovered this readathon, it was because one of the indie authors I review was sharing the fact that other people in this readathon had read his book. That's where I finally feel this sense of place. So my suggestion to anyone trying to get into readathons is don't just jump into the first one you see. It's a lot of stress if you're not already interested in what that readathon is offering. Instead, I would suggest going to readathons or waiting for a readathon that is very tailored to the bookish tastes you already have, because that's how you're going to find community in the bookish world regardless. If you jump in on a readathon for books you don't really read and aren't going to continue to read afterwards, you're not going to find that community that you thought you were. And I know that sounds really, really jaded and cynical. And yes, you can chat with people on Discord, but most of the time they want to talk about the books they're reading. And if you're not reading the same books they're reading, you're going to have a hard time of it. Now, I am really excited that I found the Indie Accords. I'm fingers crossed, so super hoping that in December comes back this year. It wasn't a thing last year, but like, I wanted to come back so badly. Please, Megan. If you find the readathons specifically tailored to the kind of books you read, you'll be better off for it. And thankfully, there are so many readathons tailored to specific kinds of books, which also leads me into my next point is people tend to not look up what readathons already exist before they make new ones. And as a result, you end up with a ton of readathons with the same premises, but a lot of people are not aware that each of the ones exist. The biggest example of this I can think is the fact that there are off the top of my head, I have heard of 3 different readathons alone focused on autism or autistic characters. And this is not the smartest idea because, again, like I mentioned before, there's already market saturation. There's already so many readathons happening so often. Your best bet would be to everyone get together and try to grow one single readathon into a decent size rather than everyone being like, I haven't seen a readathon with this. It must not exist. I'll be the one to create it. And then we have several readathons of this same kind running. I have seen readathon announcement videos that had as little as like 40 views on it, but then I saw another readathon announcement video with like a similar premise. People are creating them so fast without even trying to see if there's something else in a similar vein that they could instead volunteer to get in on so that it could expand the reach of that readathon. Because you're not going to expand the reach of a readathon without multiple bookish personalities attached to it. That's why a lot of these team readathons can reach bigger than a readathon without teams, because multiple teams have multiple hosts. All of those hosts are posting about it, and that's how those readathons get bigger, by each host pulling in their own audience. So if you're a single person trying to create a readathon without any extra help, your readathon probably isn't going to go that far unless you already have a serious following, which in general is just an issue with the bookish community. We do not have a very good central hub. We're kind of a lot of smaller creators in general. So trying to create anything bigger and communifying, is that even a word? Unifying is going to be harder. But if you had an idea for, I wish there was a readathon like X, wait, search for it, see if it already exists, and see if you can jump in on that. Now, this might also require a lot of patience, because it might just be like, oh, yeah, there was a readathon like that, and it just finished, and you're going to have to, like, wait 6 months for the next round of it, because a lot of readathons will have, like, multiple rounds over the course of the year, which, again, goes back into market saturation and not letting people draw up hype for things, and also just in general, a diminishing community and diminishing returns with people getting burnt out on it. You've seen a lot of the big booktubers moving away from reading books, or at least reading books at the same level they were, because getting burnt out on reading is a thing, especially when you're being pushed above and beyond what you would normally read constantly. You're gonna get burnt out if that's not already what your brain wants to read in a normal period of time. So get patient and wait. And sometimes being patient and waiting makes the hype more fun. Even as much as I was burnt out at the end of whatever-a-thon, I was really hyped leading into it. And I took weeks over the course of May building my perfect TBR and getting excited with other people and counting down and what book am I going to start with? It got a lot more fun when I had to wait and let the anticipation build. And even now I know that barring any other indie readathons, which, as we know, indie readathons, indie books in general, are my weakness, I will probably not participate in another readathon after July until the month of December, which will either be, depending on what's running, in December or the reindeer readathon. And just knowing that I get to build up the hype for it and get really excited for that specific readathon and not spend so much of my emotional battery on multiple readathons is going to make it a whole lot more fun than constantly feeling like I have to slog through readathons just to participate. Now, I don't know the full extent of whether or not readathons up your viewer count on videos. I know a lot of people use readathons as a way to expand their bookish reader base or their bookish viewer base. I have noticed a slight uptick in videos when I mention readathons, but mostly those viewers are only there for that readathon. They're also participating. They want to see what your TBR is, whatever. And then after the readathon is over, they're not usually going to subscribe to you unless they already like your personality. Using readathons will not necessarily get you any long-term changes unless bringing them to your channel has made them decide they like something else about your channel, aka you're reading the same kind of books they are, going back to what makes most communities in the online bookternet. So unless you're already reading books they like, or are going to just perpetually participate in readathons to use those readathon names to pull in viewers, as far as I can tell, it's not necessarily a big uptick. And in fact, some cases it can actually hurt your channel analytics if you have a lot of people subscribe to you for that readathon content and then don't watch your future videos. YouTube does not like it when you have a large subscriber count but low views. And even a lot of people see that as a negative if you have a large subscriber count and relatively low views. Do not subscribe to someone unless you intend to watch their content on a regular basis. You're not actually helping them, which is a whole other thing that booktubers get wrong so often. They get so fixated on the number of subs. They do a sub for sub thing, then nobody watches each other's content, and it screws everyone over, and no one has seemed to have learned that you should not do that. But readathons can tie into that. In general, I've been rambling for a while. I don't think readathons are bad. I don't want to see them go away. I want to see the bookish community get smarter about them. Instead of everyone creating a new readathon constantly, the minute a new idea comes to them, wait and search and find other readathons that already exist, because at this point in time, any idea you can think of for a readathon, there's probably one that, if not exactly what you're looking for, at least pretty close. Join in on that. Offer to be a host for another readathon. Offer to support another readathon. Maybe that way we won't see so many readathons get created and then die because they're all dependent on a very small group of people who get burned out. Like, let's work on having fewer readathons, but more well done. I probably should have made other comments and points, and now I'm forgetting all of them. That's the problem with these rambling discussions. But if you have any other thoughts on readathons, do you hate them? Do you love them? Do you participate in every one? Do you only have specific ones you participate in? For me, I love any indie-based ones, Whatever-a-thon, and Reindeer Readathon. And those are about the only ones I participate in anymore. I do still miss Witchathon. If Witchathon came back, even though it's a weekly format, I might still participate in at least the first round just for nostalgia. But please let me know down in the comments below. I do still participate in them. And if you are watching as one of the people that knows that I'm participating in the current readathon, I don't dislike that readathon. But yes, host faves is still going to be a struggle for me. It always is. I just don't like reading something that somebody else tells me to, apparently, even when I have many to pick from. But thank you so much for watching. If you've watched this whole thing, rambling discussions are very cathartic, even when they're very unorganized. And with nothing else to say, I hope you have a wonderful day and a marvelous tomorrow.